As a kid, I grew up in the suburbs of Amsterdam, the Netherlands. I attended a public school and really enjoyed it, most of the time at least. When I was 10 years old, I got assigned my first homework. Very exciting, of course. Although I didn't actually have the motivation to do it at first, when I opened the page, a whole new world opened up for me. I had to read an article about cool, grown-up people stuff. News that I would normally only hear about through breakfast conversations with my dad or when I was occasionally allowed to stay up till 8 p.m. to watch the grown-up people's news on TV. Through this homework, I started assessing contemporary news, such as internet regulation, the Higgs particle, and Dutch and international politics, but also just lighter topics such as movies and sports. In a way, this was the start of critical thinking for me. Why are things the way they are? Are things really the way other people say they are? What is their reasoning? And so over 7 years of my education, I found critical thinking to be one of the most, if not the most impactful lessons in both America and the Netherlands. Even though both educational systems are vastly different, curiosity and critical thinking are considered an essential trait of a good student. And as a result, I found critical thinking to be applicable to all subjects in school. From understanding why Caesar bravely led his men across the river Tiber in Latin, to grasping the most stunning mathematical equations, critical thinking has helped me solve some of the biggest mysteries at the time, and still does. The world around us, however, might be the biggest mystery itself, especially since I don't know anyone who has solved all our problems yet. So how do we make sense of the world around us? In order to do this, we cannot help but turn to the news. And therefore, I would like to discuss 3 key factors today that influence how we make sense of the world around us, namely audience, politics, and drama in news. When I came to America as a sophomore, I was overwhelmed by all the great American news coverage, and I enjoyed learning more about science, stocks, and the American political system, and mostly the Kardashians. But I was mostly surprised to find out that my American friends did not necessarily seem to know more about American news, even though there was more American news coverage compared to the Netherlands. My Dutch friends seemed to know just as much about Dutch news as my American friends seemed to know about American news. And data from Pew Research Center actually suggests the same. Europeans follow their national news about as closely as Americans follow American news. However, there is one great distinction, namely between international news coverage. Europeans seem to follow international news a lot more than Americans do. And again, my American and Dutch friends seem to highlight this difference as well. Philip Sipe, a professor at Marquette University, says that much American news coverage is grounded in naivete that produces a solipsistic view of international affairs, an intellectual unilateralism that poorly serves the public. One example of this is the Beijing Olympic Games. When the most mentioned articles were measured in 2008, an article about the Beijing Olympic Games was only the 15th most mentioned article in America. How can such an important international event, during which the United States had won an astonishing 36 golden medals, only be the 15th most mentioned article? Especially when compared to Europe, this is particularly strange. Every time there's a major international tournament that includes athletes from a European country, Dutch news seem to follow this frequently and in depth. And as a result, I would be constantly kept up to date, even about sports that I'm not necessarily interested in. Live streams, blogs, analyses, the news just wouldn't let me alone. However, if we contrast this to American news, for example, A Beijing article was the second most mentioned article in 2008 in the Netherlands. And the most mentioned article of that year was another international story, namely the election of Barack Obama. The key driver for this difference is money. Every major news outlet's main goal is to make money in order to survive. However, how European and American news outlets have adapted to this over time is different. Similarly, political attitudes also determines whether a reader will buy or not buy an article, and thus whether a news outlet will actually gain money or lose money. However, how European and American news outlets have adapted to this is not only different, but it has also changed over time. In 1976, an Italian newspaper called La Repubblica debuted in Italy, and this was a groundbreaking evolution in news reporting. As its founder stated, it doesn't pretend to follow an illusory political neutrality, but it declares explicitly that it has taken a side in a political battle. La Repubblica did this also from a money perspective, as it tried to become more accessible and reach more female readers. And over time, most European news outlets actually adapted the same rhetoric. Many European news outlets became affiliated with political parties, trade unions, and churches. But at the same time, the opposite was happening in America. There was an increasing number of American news outlets, to which owners responded with becoming less politically affiliated. But as some news outlets gained more traction, they also slowly moved away from this standpoint and actually became more politically affiliated. Yet, as of now, most American news outlets still like to proclaim as if they are politically neutral. And again, this makes sense from a money perspective. If we look at the numbers, 75% of all Americans think that it is never acceptable for news outlets to be politically biased. And almost half of all Americans think that American news outlets are currently doing a bad job of this. So, how would you change this as a reader? Perhaps turn to multiple news sources to be able to apply critical thinking. I know I would. Yet, 51% of all Americans actually admit that they're loyal to their own news sources. And more shockingly, 76% of all Americans are loyal to their news sources in behavior. This ultimately makes it harder for Americans to understand what is an altered view of reality and what is an actual clear depiction of reality. The third key factor of drama also influences how we make sense of the world around us. After political and differences in audience, drama is a similarity that both Europe and American news outlets share. If we look at American and European news outlets side by side, it becomes clear that both tend to highlight drama over information. Journalist Peter Arnett says that a foreign story that doesn't involve bombs, natural disasters, or financial calamities has little chance of entering the American consciousness. So if we look at Thursday's front page of a European and American news outlet, it is clear that indeed both tend to highlight drama over information. Yet the means through which both accomplish this is different. If we look at American news titles, it becomes clear that they tend to use more opinionated titles compared to European outlets' more objective titles. And I soon realized that this sparks a completely different reaction from the reader. Upon reading an opinionated title, the reader will either immediately agree or disagree with the article, without even having read the article itself. How can this happen? The reader has not even considered the article and already claims that it knows what's going on, and it has not even used critical thinking. And so over time, the reader will become predetermined about the news outlet itself. Ultimately, the newsreader will become pushed into a corner and will only read about news sources that they know and that they like, without having even considered news outlets that might even be right, that might challenge them, and to which they can apply critical thinking. And so the three key factors of drama, politics, and audience influence how we use critical thinking. Most of the time, this actually undermines the effectiveness of critical thinking. And so, how do we change this? Before talking about how we change this, I would like to point out why this is so important. And to do this, I would like to draw a comparison between American news outlets and pre-World War II Germany. At the time, there were 4,700 German newspapers. Each of these was geographically and ideologically distinct from one another, and thus targeted a specific audience. Der Stürmer, for example, specifically targeted anti-Semitists through dramatic reasoning, which seemed to stick with the German people. And over time, most political parties also started their own newspapers. And as the Nazi Party gained more traction, Hitler specifically used these three key factors to convince his audience that his distorted view of reality is the only right one. Hitler was an excellent public speaker who wrote his own speeches, worked late into the night, and practiced in front of a mirror, all to perfect these three key factors in order to convince the German people that his ideas were correct. So now, getting back to why and how we should get the better view of the world around us. First, we have to look at how we acquire news sources. 45% of all American adults say that their main source of news is social media. However, the algorithms that social media companies such as Snapchat and Instagram use are specifically designed to make sure that users keep coming back. And as a result, social media creates an echo chamber. In this echo chamber, users are only exposed to articles that the companies know users will like and will agree with. And as a result, users will only be challenged with articles that they like and will not see other sides of the reality. And as a result, users will not be able to apply critical thinking, as everything what they see is what they think reality actually is. But stepping out of your echo chamber is not as easy as it seems. In both America and Europe, people from different echo chambers have met with more aggression. Politically, there's been a growing divide between liberals and conservatives in America, and there's been a rise of various populist parties in Europe. And socially, there have been clashes such as in Charlottesville in America and yellow vest protests in Europe. Ultimately, I think that we have to turn back to education. Whereas I was first introduced to news analysis in school, I believe that we must institute a greater emphasis on this at school. Critical thinking involves understanding the source. And with critical thinking, we can teach students to form their own opinions, learn from others, and work out their differences through words and reason. As Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stated, the function of education is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically. Intelligence plus character. That is the goal of true education. Thank you.